Darkness was the greatest monster of all. In medieval Europe, when the sun went down, fear came alive. For people of the Middle Ages, night was not peaceful. It was terrifying. There were no street lamps, no glowing cities, only the flicker of candles and torches. And beyond that faint circle of light, endless blackness. Here's a fact. In medieval villages, people rarely left their homes after sunset. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. Fires kept burning in hearths to push away the dark. To step outside was to risk your soul. Why? Because the night belonged to creatures. Some real, some imagined. Wolves roamed forests and sometimes attacked livestock or even people. Owls, with their haunting cries, were seen as omens of death. The howling of the wind became the whisper of demons. But even more frightening were the stories. Parents used them to keep children inside at night. Priests used them to warn against sin. And neighbors whispered them as gossip when fires burned low. One of the most common fears was the black dog. Across England, France, and Germany, tales spread of a giant hound with glowing red eyes that prowled roads at night. It was said to be the devil's companion. If you saw it, death would soon follow. Some even claimed the dog could vanish in smoke when confronted with a cross. Another fear was the wild hunt. In Germanic and Scandinavian folklore, villagers spoke of ghostly riders sweeping through the skies at night. Led by a dark lord or even the devil himself, the hunt chased the souls of the living. To hear their horns was a warning. To see them meant you might be carried away forever. Here's a fact. Medieval chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis in the 12th century wrote about entire processions of spirits, dressed in black, marching across the land at night. People swore they had seen them, and monks recorded these stories as proof of the supernatural. But the darkness was not only filled with monsters. It was also filled with the devil's agents. Every sound, every shadow could be a demon. Church sermons taught that evil spirits prowled at night, tempting the faithful. Dreams were not just imagination. They could be visits from incubus or succubus demons, feeding on fear and desire. Imagine being a farmer in the year 1350. The day is over. Your animals are locked in the barn. Your children sleep by the fire. But outside the window, the forest is alive with sounds. A branch snaps. Wolves howl in the distance. The wind rattles the door. And you whisper a prayer, hoping the night passes quickly. Here's another fact. The word nightmare in medieval times did not mean a bad dream. It referred to an evil spirit, the Mara, that pressed down on people as they slept, choking them. What we now know as sleep paralysis was once believed to be a demon sitting on the chest. So in the medieval world, darkness itself was an enemy. It hid both natural dangers and supernatural terrors. It turned forests into haunted realms, villages into prisons, and sleep into a battlefield of the soul. The night was not empty. It was full of whispers, shadows, and creatures waiting in the dark. And this was only the beginning, because once fear had taken hold of the dark, the church stepped in to explain it. And in their sermons, fear became flesh. Demons, succubi, and spirits were given names and faces. If the night was filled with shadows, the church gave those shadows names. And the names were demons. In medieval Europe, fear was not left to imagination. It was shaped, directed, and amplified by the church. Priests warned that demons lurked in darkness, that they whispered temptations, that they attacked the faithful in their sleep, and that they served only one master, the devil. Here's a fact. The Catholic Church officially taught that demons were fallen angels. Once glorious, they had rebelled with Lucifer and been cast into hell. But they were not trapped. They roamed the earth hunting souls. Sermons painted terrifying pictures. Demons could twist dreams. They could cause sickness. They could ruin crops and tempt children. And worst of all, they could appear in human form. One of the most feared legends was of the incubus and succubus. The incubus was a male demon who attacked women at night. The succubus, his female counterpart, seduced men in their sleep. Priests preached that such encounters could even result in demon children, half human, half fiend. Here's another fact. Medieval medical texts sometimes included warnings about nocturnal visitations. Doctors and priests alike believed these demons caused infertility, madness, or even death. But demons were not only lovers in the dark. They were destroyers. Monks wrote of demons knocking over lamps in monasteries, starting fires, or stealing holy books. Some even described demons sitting on the chest of sleeping monks, choking them, another echo of what we now call sleep paralysis. The church used these fears as weapons. If a farmer's crops failed, it was not chance, it was demons. If a child grew sick, it was not disease, it was possession. And the only protection: prayer, confession, and obedience to the church. Here's a chilling fact. Medieval exorcisms were not rare. They were performed publicly, with priests commanding demons in the name of Christ. Some rituals involved holy water, relics, or entire processions through villages to drive out evil. Imagine the scene. A woman claims that at night, a dark figure visits her. She screams, she thrashes, she refuses food. Her neighbors whisper, "Demon." Her family brings her to the church. The priest begins the ritual. Candles flicker, Latin chants echo, and every cough, every shiver, every cry is seen as proof of the devil's presence. The church also taught that demons could work through witches. Women who practiced forbidden arts were said to be servants of hell. Demons gave them power, the ability to curse, to summon storms, to sicken cattle. This link between demons and witches would later fuel some of the darkest persecutions in European history. Here's one more fact. Even great scholars like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century wrote that demons could influence the physical world. They could control winds, spread disease, and even inspire sinful thoughts in the hearts of men. For Aquinas, demons were not fairy tales, they were real enemies. So the night was no longer just empty darkness. It was a battlefield. Every shadow could hide a demon. Every dream could be an attack. And the church stood as the only shield between people and the endless army of hell. But if demons haunted the night, so too did creatures born not of scripture, but of folklore. Legends whispered of wolves that became men, of spirits rising from graves, of monsters that stalked rivers and forests. If demons belonged to the church, monsters belonged to the people. In villages and forests, legends grew teeth and claws. And in the Middle Ages, folklore was as real as scripture. Across Europe, peasants told stories of creatures that stalked the night. Stories whispered by firesides. Stories told to children to keep them home after sunset. Stories that mixed fear with imagination, but felt more real than dreams. One of the most enduring was the werewolf. In France, Germany, and Eastern Europe, tales spread of men who could change into wolves. Some said it was a curse. Others claimed it was a punishment from God. And in some regions, people believed men willingly made a pact with the devil, gaining the power to hunt at night in the form of a beast. Here's a fact. In 1521, in the French town of Poligny, two men named Pierre Berget and Michel Verdun were tried as werewolves. They confessed, under torture, that they had made a pact with the devil and hunted children as wolves. They were executed not for murder alone but for being monsters. But wolves were not the only predators of folklore. In Eastern Europe, there was the Uper, a creature that fed on the blood of the living. It would rise from its grave at night, creeping into homes, leaving corpses pale and drained. These legends were the early roots of the vampire myths that would later inspire Dracula. Here's another fact. In the 12th century, chroniclers in England recorded tales of revenants, the restless dead who rose from their graves. Villagers described corpses walking at night, attacking the living. Priests sometimes ordered the bodies dug up, beheaded, or burned to stop the terror. And then there were the waters. Rivers, lakes, and swamps were believed to hide their own monsters. In Germany, peasants feared the Nyx, a shape-shifting water spirit that lured children to drown. In Slavic lands, the Rusalka was said to be the restless soul of a drowned woman, her pale form dragging men beneath the surface. Imagine being a child in a medieval village. Your parents warn you, don't go to the forest at night, the werewolves hunt there. Don't go near the river, the spirits will pull you under. These were not fairy tales. They were survival rules. Here's a chilling fact. Even nobles believed in monsters. King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, wrote a book in 1597 called Demonology. It warned of witches, spirits, and monstrous transformations. When kings feared monsters, peasants had no reason to doubt. Folklore also reflected the fears of the age. Werewolves appeared in times of famine, when wolves really did attack villages. Vampire-like revenants were born from plagues, when bodies piled high and people whispered of restless corpses. Water spirits explained the sudden, tragic drownings that were common in a world without safety. Here's one more fact. Some medieval bestiaries, books that described animals, both real and imaginary, included creatures like manticores, unicorns, and basilisks. These were not seen as fiction. They were lessons in morality. The basilisk, for example, was said to kill with a glance, a warning against pride and sin. So folklore was not just entertainment. It was fear turned into stories. It was the imagination of peasants trying to explain a dangerous world. But the most terrifying figures were not only wolves, vampires, or water spirits. They were the witches, women accused of flying at night, attending sabbaths, and dancing with demons. They were the flesh and blood monsters of the Middle Ages, and soon they would become the hunted. If monsters haunted the forests, witches haunted the imagination. They were not only the villains of stories. They were neighbors, healers, widows, anyone who could be feared. And in the Middle Ages, witches became the most terrifying monsters of all. The church taught that witches were real, that they were not just old women with herbs, but servants of the devil, and that at night they gathered in secret meetings called sabbaths. These stories were repeated in sermons, in books, and in whispers by firelight. Here's a fact. The word Sabbath was borrowed from Jewish tradition, but twisted by the church to describe gatherings of witches. According to medieval belief, witches flew through the night on broomsticks or even on animals, guided by demons, to meet the devil himself. At these Sabbaths, it was said, witches performed rituals that horrified the faithful. They danced in circles naked under the moon. They feasted on unholy food. They kissed the devil's hand, or even worse, his body. And they plotted curses to bring sickness, storms, and death upon the land. Here's another fact. The infamous book Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1487, devoted entire chapters to describing how witches supposedly met in secret, how they recruited new members, and how they destroyed Christian communities. It read like a medieval horror story, and it was used as a legal guide to prosecute thousands. But fear of witches was not only a clerical invention. Folklore fed it too. Villagers told stories of women transforming into animals, of witches stealing milk from cows, or of them muttering curses that killed livestock. Every small tragedy could be explained by witchcraft. Imagine the scene. A child falls sick overnight. The mother recalls that an old woman looked at the child strangely the day before. The rumor spreads. Soon the entire village whispers. Witch. Here's a chilling fact. In 15th and 16th century Germany, trials often included evidence of sabbaths. Accused women, tortured until they confessed, described wild gatherings they had never truly attended. But because their stories matched the church's teachings, judges believed them. The Sabbath was not only a myth, it was a weapon. It gave shape to the fears of the people and justification for the hunts. By convincing Europe that witches met in vast, demonic assemblies, the church turned scattered accusations into mass persecutions. Here's one more fact. Witches were said to create storms by boiling strange brews and chanting spells. Sailors feared them, farmers cursed them, and priests warned that they could ruin entire kingdoms with a single Sabbath. So whenever crops failed or ships sank, witches were blamed. Folklore and church doctrine merged into one vision, witches as the enemy within. Not monsters in the woods, not demons in dreams, but human beings who walked among the people, who smiled, who prayed, who lived in plain sight, yet were said to serve hell. So witches became the nightmare that could never be escaped. For demons were far away, and wolves lived in forests, but witches lived next door. And when Europe was struck by disasters too vast to explain, storms, wars, and above all, plague, it was often witches who took the blame. The fear of witches grew stronger, feeding on catastrophe. Not all monsters had fangs or claws. Some came in silence. Some rode the winds. And in the Middle Ages, the deadliest monster of all was the plague. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, people struggled to explain it. They did not know about bacteria or rats or fleas, so they gave the plague a face. They made it into a demon, a curse, a monster that stalked the land. Here's a fact. Chroniclers described the plague as a black cloud drifting across Europe, killing wherever it passed. Some said it was carried by foul winds. Others believed it was shot like arrows from the sky by God's angels of wrath. And many were sure it was the work of witches, demons, or even the devil himself. Art captured these fears. One of the most famous images was the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death. Painted on church walls across Europe, it showed skeletons leading kings, peasants, and priests alike into the grave. It was a reminder that no one, no matter their rank, could escape the monster of plague. Here's another fact. In Lübeck, Germany, a 15th century mural shows death as a grinning skeleton playing a fiddle, forcing the living to dance. It was not just art. It was a warning. The plague was not an invisible sickness. It was a character, a being, a hunter of souls. People also spoke of the plague doctor, though the iconic beaked mask only became common later, in the 17th century. In the Middle Ages, doctors and priests wore amulets, carried flowers, or burned incense to fight the monster they believed was spreading in the air. But for the common people, the sight of these figures was as terrifying as the disease itself. Imagine walking through your village. The bells of the church toll constantly. Carts carry the dead to mass graves. And people whisper that death itself walks the streets, cloaked in black, marking doors with invisible hands. Here's a chilling fact. Some towns blamed the plague on witches poisoning wells. In Strasbourg in 1349, hundreds of Jews were burned alive after being accused of causing the Black Death. The plague became not only a killer, but an excuse for persecution. Priests sometimes described the sickness as a demon that entered the body, feeding on blood and breath. And poets wrote of death as a lover, cold and relentless, embracing all without mercy. The fear was not only of dying. It was of being taken by something beyond human understanding. A monster you could not fight with swords or prayers. A monster that turned whole kingdoms into cemeteries. Here's one more fact. In some Italian towns, people painted angels battling demons above city gates, hoping to keep the plague away. Others held processions, carrying statues of saints to frighten the sickness like one would frighten a beast. So the plague was not seen as a disease. It was a predator, a demon, a monster that walked hand in hand with death itself. But fear did not vanish with the plague years. Even after the sickness ebbed, its shadow lingered. And many of the monsters of folklore, demons, witches, spirits, fused with the memory of plague, creating a legacy of nightmares that haunted Europe for centuries. The Middle Ages ended. The centuries of darkness gave way to new light. But the monsters of medieval Europe never truly died. They lingered in memory, in art, and in the stories we still tell today. For people of the Middle Ages, fear was everywhere. In the night, in the forest, in the river, in their very dreams. Demons haunted the church. Wolves and spirits prowled the villages. Witches gathered in the skies. And plague walked the land as a skeleton with a scythe. Here's a fact. Even after the witch hunts ended and science advanced, many of these fears survived in folklore. In rural parts of Germany, villagers still spoke of werewolves well into the 18th century. In Eastern Europe, tales of the Uper, the blood drinker, continued until they evolved into vampire legends that inspired Gothic novels in the 19th century. Art carried the legacy too. The Danse Macabre remained painted on church walls, reminding everyone that death comes for kings and peasants alike. Medieval bestiaries, filled with creatures like basilisks and manticores, were copied and read long after people stopped believing in them as real animals. Here's another fact. The witch figure in children's fairy tales, the old woman in the forest, luring children with food, is a direct descendant of medieval fears of witches who cursed harvests and stole babies. What terrified peasants in the 14th century became bedtime stories in the 19th. But the legacy is not only in folklore. It is in psychology. The Middle Ages showed how fear could control societies, how stories could be turned into weapons, how belief in monsters could justify trials, executions, and massacres. Imagine a medieval child hearing stories of the black dog, or of witches flying in the night. That child grows up and tells the same stories to their children. Over centuries, legends became traditions. Traditions became culture. And culture became the roots of our modern horror. Here's a chilling fact. Even in modern times, echoes of medieval fears remain. Sleep paralysis, once explained as a demon sitting on the chest, is still called the old hag in English folklore and Mara in Scandinavian tradition. The nightmare never fully left. The witch, the vampire, the werewolf, the plague, these figures shaped how Europe imagined fear. And even today, their shadows live on in movies, books, and urban legends. Every time a horror story speaks of a dark figure at night, or a cursed forest, it is repeating medieval Europe's greatest fears. So the legacy of medieval nightmares is not only history. It is the foundation of horror itself. From folklore to fairy tales, from sermons to cinema, the monsters of the Middle Ages still walk among us. The Middle Ages may be gone. The villages may be ruins. The forests may be cut down. But the fears remain. They whisper in the dark, reminding us that monsters never truly die. They only change shape.